Beijing is calling for global economic unity and an end to trade wars. So, is that an expression of a sincere belief or a response to the economic impact of European and US moves to decouple from China? Well, to answer that question and many more, I'm joined by Alicia Garcia Herrero, Chief Economist for Asia Pacific at French investment bank Natixis. Thank you so much for joining us. You're joining us from Hong Kong. Are we seeing a shift, though, in tone from Beijing when it comes to its trade relations with the West?
Well, I would say that Beijing is increasingly aware of how costly it is for China if the West de-risks. And I think this is prompting Beijing to basically come up with a more conciliatory approach to the West, at least in the narrative. At the same time, exactly as you mentioned, these conciliatory words being pronounced, we also heard that China has just started an investigation, anti-dumping investigation, on a number of liquor companies from Europe, Cointreau and Remy, I believe. So, narrative and facts are two different issues.
Yeah, indeed. They haven't exactly called a ceasefire, have they? Well, just stay with us, Alicia. I just want to play the soundbite that spurred this conversation. It comes from the spokesman for China's foreign ministry, Wang Wenbin.
What the world needs most is unity, and what should be prevented most is division. A trade war, a science and technology war, exercises in decoupling or de-risking are in essence the politicization of economic and trade issues. They're an attempt to monopolize advantages and impede the development and progress of the vast number of emerging markets. They deprive the world's 7 billion people of the right to pursue a happy life. This is immoral and unsustainable.
Immoral and unsustainable. Alicia Garcia Herrero from Natixis. This statement could hardly have been firmer, really, but it does seem to imply that Beijing isn't in some way responsible for the deterioration of trade relations with the West. Is that a fair characterization of the situation, though?
Well, I mean, this statement might raise our eyebrows in the West, but it is a very smart statement when it comes to the rest of the world, because it's everybody against the West, if you read it carefully. I mean, 7 billion people, to be precise. And I think this is really China leading this global South, or at least trying to. I mean, India might not agree, but at the end of the day, for India to do the same, they have to raise also our eyebrows, meaning they have to use the same language. So at the end of the day, as far as the West is concerned, this is very dangerous, because it sounds, yes, we're fully responsible for these actions that may indeed be, to some extent, one could argue that they are protectionist. What is not being said, though, is that China's own protectionism is hurting not only us, but certainly the rest of the 7 billion people, because it hurts the emerging world as well. So, this is, I think, we should not underestimate really how effective this message is with the rest of the world, with the global South.
And actually, Beijing is by no means the only organisation that is calling for greater global unity. Wang Wenbin was actually responding to comments made by the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, which obviously isn't an organisation that normally necessarily sees eye to eye with China. China would point out that it is dominated by the US and Europe somewhat. Kristalina Georgieva warned against the world fragmenting further into economic blocs. Just have a look at this quote. She pointed out that the IMF had done the maths and that the result was quite dramatic, she said. She said further division could wipe up to 7% off global GDP, and that would be like France and Germany going missing from the map of the world. So, Alicia Garcia Herrero, both the IMF and China singing from the same song sheet, it seems here, and saying that the world only loses out if the global economy does fragment. So, I mean, are they both therefore right?
Well, I put it this way. It's very I would say very often Chinese policy makers, officials, diplomats use words pronounced by Western officials, international organizations, in a different reading, but seemingly having the same meaning. And I think this is the case you pointed out very clearly.
Yes, because I'm sure the IMF would include China in that sort of warning that people, that countries do need to come together,
exactly.
Whereas China is obviously saying it's for everyone else to come and join us.
Exactly. What the IMF is saying is that fragmentation, no matter who starts it, and to some extent China has started it in many areas. If you think about the collapse of Chinese imports, China's vertical integration, China's industrial policy, all of that could be as easily criticized by the IMF as our own industrial policy, which has come much later and which much smaller funds, much smaller subsidies, at least in the case of Europe. So, this is the thing. Who is the IMF referring to? That's the question that I think makes a big difference when reading that compared to the Chinese statement.
But the IMF, in this case, Kristalina Georgieva, I mean, she probably is referring to the fact that European countries and the US have decoupled actively from China in recent years, and particularly since the pandemic, as they've tried to protect their supply chains. I mean, they've obviously come to the conclusion that decoupling is the right thing to do and the smart thing to do. So, I mean, where is the logic that's being used by the US and Europe for doing that?
Well, I have a strong belief that the globalization that we had prior to the pandemic, prior to the trade war, was unsustainable. I don't know how the IMF, put it this way, the IMF calculates losses out of a status quo that does not exist anymore, because that globalization was bringing enormous amount of inequalities, also in the West. Part of the reason why we have that is technology, not China, but the question is, how do we deal with that? So I think the IMF's calculations are a bit naive, because they compare the future to today's reality. At the same time, that reality does not exist anymore. So, I would argue that the world had to move on from the massive centralization of supply chains in a single country. That's very risky, and I'm not sure that's optimal by all means and purposes. So first thing is, why would we keep something that we've suffered from? Not only the West, by the way, but the whole world. So that would be the beginning of a discussion. I mean, what type of globalization do we need? Maybe not the fragmentation we're getting into, but then what do we need? What are the changes we need to make? And I think all of that is not being really discussed, which is the key issue.
Yeah, I suppose China was the big winner from the globalization, having had decades of unbroken, uninterrupted growth underneath that system. Let's talk about the impact that decoupling is having on the Chinese economy, because the West's de-risking, another way that it's being phrased, from China, is starting to show up in Beijing's economic figures. Notably, in the third quarter of last year, China posted its very first ever quarterly deficit in foreign direct investment. FDI, as it is sometimes known, came to a negative $11.8 billion during that quarter. That means that foreign firms basically took more money out of China than they invested in. Now, some of that money went into building production sites at home, but some of it also went to emerging markets that are considered more friendly to the West, including countries like Thailand and India. So, Alicia Garcia Herrero, is this a peace-loving tone from Beijing? Is it an attempt to rescue its own economy and get it fired up again?
Let me answer this question with some figures I've worked on just yesterday, which is Taiwanese investment, foreign direct investment into the mainland, because it is very telling. Taiwanese foreign investment into the mainland has collapsed from 65% of total Taiwanese foreign direct investment to 35%. Is this de-risking? Not really, meaning a lot is economically driven. It's simply because Taiwanese manufacturers find that costs in China are increasingly high, that the market is not growing as much as, say, India. For that matter, soon India will grow literally double China so we're already like 40% above, but soon it will be double. So, I think we need to realize that beyond the de-risking story that governments are pushing companies to move out of China, a lot is just economically driven, market driven. And this is very simple. The reason is that China is growing less and that the market is much more competitive with local players. So foreign manufacturers can't make the money they used to. So it is much more natural than we think. And this is why I think trying to avoid this trend, trying to stop this trend it's not going to work from Beijing side.
But you know that Beijing would disagree with you on this, and has
yes,
said as much that supply chains are being politicized. And when we talk about the reasons why the likes of European countries and the United States are localizing their supply chains, it is because they are concerned that political differences with China could get in the way of them securing their supply chain. So that is politicized to an extent, isn't it?
I would say that if you talk to, and I do, many manufacturers, Japanese, South Korean, say, take Samsung. Samsung left partially and then fully a few years later, but partially China in 2008. Even before China started playing with, Lotte, and because of the installation of THAAD, the anti-missile U.S. device in South Korea. Well before. Why did they do it when China was growing more than anybody else in 2008? Because they had other reasons, and these were mostly economic reasons. So I actually think that we should not buy into that story, no matter how much Beijing shouts, because it's not good for us. Why? Because our governance may be pushing for the risking without a need, meaning companies may actually think through this and realize that the markets might be elsewhere, both for sourcing, but also basically for selling, for demand. And that would be much healthier for us, and in a way, much less of it would deserve much less criticism from Beijing. So I think we need to realize that many companies are actually moving for reasons unrelated to geopolitics. And that's something that is going to continue to happen as China's growth rate comes down even further.
So does that mean that this schism that has taken form, that this split between the West and China cannot be closed even by political statements like we've heard from Beijing?
No, it cannot, because for companies, the private sector, but even foreign governments. But let's focus on the companies. They need to see the real intentions. They need to see the country's going to grow. They need to see that there won't be crackdown on the private sector, even private Chinese companies, let alone foreign. So all of that needs to be seen. It's not enough to make these big statements. They seem to be talking to the officials, to the leaders in the West, but you also need to convince corporations. Corporations may smile at you when you're in San Francisco at a dinner, but the minute they need to take a decision, they may diversify because they just don't want to put all of their eggs in the same basket. That's it.
So are we to expect during the course of 2024, and we've heard it from the IMF, we've heard it from Beijing, are we to expect to see more pressure on the West to try and mend relations and reinvest in China?
Absolutely, because not only invest in China. So I think what China needs is not so much our investment anymore. It needs obviously our technology, but most importantly, it needs us to accept its products. This is the key. So China will put pressure on us for us to keep our markets open. That's the key. And also to keep, if we decide, countervailing duties on electric vehicles, you name it, at least allow Chinese electric vehicles, to talk about, you know, a very obvious case, to basically invest greenfield in Europe, to produce in Europe. And I think that's the key. They need that. They need standards. They need their, you know, COMAC 919 to be approved by the European Commission, so that commercial airplane can be sold to the world. Yes. So that's what they need from us. It's not only investment. It's more our markets, our standards. That's what they need from us. Because
so does that mean we should expect
the key.
We should expect a more conciliatory tone from Beijing throughout the next year?
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
This is a charm offensive.
Charm offensive to continue, not only to bring investment, most importantly to keep our markets open. Yeah.
But presumably Western countries do stand to benefit from a more friendly China, though.
Well, it depends on what you give away by doing that. The US is not going to keep its markets open, because the more we hear, even Biden, is more tariffs. So what does this mean? That yes, we may feel better by having a conciliatory China, a charm offensive, but what really is going to mean there is that our markets are going to be flooded by Chinese products because they can't go to the US. So for Europe, this is a big deal, because, you know, it's going to mean that China is going to gain market share in many more products in Europe, in our own market. And that charm offensive is really to achieve that goal. So what shall we do about it? That's a big question for Europe.
Indeed it is, and it's a question people will be asking themselves in Brussels and capitals across the continent. Alicia Garcia Herrero from Natixis, thank you so much for talking us through all of this.
Yep.
And thanks to you for watching at home. There is plenty more from us here on the DW News YouTube channel, so please click on the next one and we'll see you over there.